6 historical legends who died from syphilis. History remembers its giants through carefully sanitized lenses. Great thinkers, powerful leaders, artistic geniuses. Their stories arrive in our textbooks polished, perfected, and painfully incomplete. But behind the carefully constructed legends lurks a darker truth that biographers and historians have often erased. The ravages of an ancient disease that quietly claimed some of history's most brilliant minds. Syphilis was the unspoken plague of the elite, revealed a medical historian who has studied historical health records. Before antibiotics, it wasn't just common, it was rampant among the powerful and creative classes. But it carried such stigma that diagnoses were disguised, death certificates falsified, and medical records sealed or destroyed to protect reputations. This conspiracy of silence has hidden one of history's most tragic patterns. Legendary figures whose public decline was attributed to everything from alcoholism to eccentricity, when the actual culprit was the devastating neurological effects of untreated syphilis. The symptoms of late-stage syphilis, paranoia, erratic behavior, delusions, memory loss, could easily be dismissed as the excesses of genius, explained a neurologist who has studied the disease's historical impact. That made it the perfect hidden killer of famous figures. Their deterioration was hiding in plain sight, misattributed to alcohol, drugs, or simply the price of brilliance. What makes these cases particularly heartbreaking is the timing. Many of these legends contracted the disease in an era when treatment existed, but carried its own terrible stigma. Their fame and wealth couldn't save them from a bacterial infection that would be cured today with a simple course of antibiotics. It's one of history's cruelest ironies, noted a biographer who has researched several victims of the disease. These extraordinary individuals, people who changed culture, art, and business forever, were brought down not by worthy adversaries, but by a microscopic organism that modern medicine has rendered nearly powerless. These 6 remarkable figures reveal how a disease once called the Great Imitator claimed some of history's greatest minds, while hiding behind a veil of secrecy that, in some cases, remains partially intact even today.
I came to Chicago with $40 in my pocket. My son is now 12. I'm still married and I love my wife dear.
Al Capone, the gangster king brought down by an invisible enemy. Al Capone built an empire through ruthless violence and criminal genius, becoming America's most notorious gangster during Prohibition. At the height of his power, he controlled Chicago through a complex network of bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling operations that generated an estimated $100 million annually, the equivalent of over $1.5 billion today. No rival gangster could touch him. Even the federal government struggled to bring him down, eventually resorting to tax evasion charges when murder indictments proved impossible. Yet the force that ultimately destroyed America's most famous criminal wasn't the law, a rival gang, or even imprisonment. It was the advanced stages of syphilis he likely contracted as a young man. Capone's story is typically told as a rise and fall narrative that ends with his imprisonment at Alcatraz, explained a crime historian who has studied Capone extensively. But the truly tragic final chapter came after his release, when neurosyphilis had so thoroughly destroyed his mind that the once brilliant criminal mastermind had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. Medical records indicate that Capone likely contracted syphilis as a teenager or young adult, possibly during his early days working in brothels. Like many men of his era, he either received inadequate treatment or ignored the initial symptoms entirely, allowing the disease to establish a foothold in his system that would emerge decades later with devastating consequences. Capone was actually diagnosed with syphilis during his imprisonment at Alcatraz in the 1930s, revealed a medical researcher who has reviewed historical prison records. Doctors documented that he was showing signs of paresis, the neurological damage caused by late-stage syphilis. He received some treatment, but it was too late to reverse the brain damage that had already occurred. When Capone was released from prison in 1939, due to his deteriorating health, he was already experiencing significant cognitive decline. The man who once commanded a criminal empire with military precision could no longer perform simple arithmetic or maintain basic conversations. His legendary temper, once controlled and strategically deployed, gave way to unpredictable emotional outbursts. By 1945, Capone was essentially childlike, noted a biographer who interviewed people who knew him in his final years. He would fish in his swimming pool, convinced he was catching big hauls. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. The mental deterioration was complete and irreversible. On January 25, 1947, Capone died at his Palm Island estate in Florida, the official cause listed as stroke and pneumonia. But the underlying condition that had reduced America's most feared criminal to a confused, childlike state was neurosyphilis, the final stage of a disease that had been quietly destroying his brain for decades. What makes Capone's case particularly tragic from a medical perspective is that penicillin had been discovered and was being used to treat syphilis by the mid-1940s, observed the medical historian. Had he contracted the disease just a decade or two later, a simple course of antibiotics could have prevented the entire devastating progression. Instead, one of history's most notorious criminals was defeated not by justice, but by a treatable bacterial infection. While Capone's mental deterioration happened largely out of the public eye, our next legendary figure's decline became the subject of wild speculation and rumor that continues to this day, the strange case of a billionaire whose eccentric behavior may have had a medical explanation few were willing to acknowledge.
Purpose in this flight is to further your program next year of bringing together in New York.
Howard Hughes. When genius gives way to madness. Howard Hughes embodied American ambition in its purest form, a billionaire industrialist, legendary aviator, Hollywood producer, and technological innovator whose restless genius seemed boundless. Yet his final years present a disturbing portrait of paranoia, obsessive-compulsive behavior, and physical deterioration that transformed the handsome tycoon into a skeletal recluse. While official biographies typically attribute Hughes' decline to psychological disorders, a growing body of evidence suggests that untreated syphilis may have been the hidden catalyst for his most bizarre behaviors and ultimate physical collapse. Hughes's symptoms align almost perfectly with the classic progression of neurosyphilis, explained a neuropsychiatrist who has studied the billionaire's medical history. The increasing paranoia, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, deteriorating personal hygiene, and eventual physical wasting are textbook manifestations of the disease when it reaches the central nervous system. Hughes's legendary promiscuity during his Hollywood years created ample opportunity for infection. As the handsome producer behind films like Hell's Angels and The Outlaw, Hughes engaged in sexual relationships with countless actresses and socialites during the 1920s and 1930s, a period when syphilis was still common and often undiagnosed. Hughes's romantic history reads like a perfect storm for syphilis exposure, noted a Hollywood historian. He was extraordinarily active sexually during an era before antibiotics, often with women from the entertainment world, where infection rates were particularly high. The probability that he was exposed multiple times is virtually certain. What makes the syphilis theory particularly compelling is how it explains the otherwise baffling transformation of Hughes from functioning eccentric to incapacitated recluse. While his odd behaviors began much earlier, they accelerated dramatically in the 1950s and 1960s, the time frame when untreated syphilis typically progresses to its devastating tertiary stage. The progression is striking, observed a biographer who has studied Hughes extensively. In the 1930s and 40s, Hughes was certainly unusual, but still fully functional, flying planes, running businesses, appearing in public. By the 1960s, he was a prisoner of increasingly bizarre compulsions, watching the same movies repeatedly for days, writing extensive manuals about how his staff should open a can of fruit, and refusing all human contact. Hughes's physical deterioration in his final years also aligns with advanced syphilitic infection. By the time of his death in 1976, the once robust 6'4" tycoon weighed just 90 pounds, had grotesquely long fingernails and hair, and suffered from severe malnutrition despite his billions. The wasting, the neglect of basic hygiene, the extreme isolation, these are all consistent with the dementia paralytica phase of syphilis, explained the neuropsychiatrist. The disease essentially destroys the frontal lobes, eliminating normal judgment and self-care instincts while causing physical deterioration. If Hughes did indeed suffer from syphilis, why wasn't it treated? Medical historians point to a combination of factors unique to Hughes's situation. Hughes had assembled a team of doctors who essentially served as enablers rather than healers, noted a medical ethicist who has studied the case. These physicians were employees dependent on Hughes for their livelihood, not independent medical providers. If Hughes refused testing or treatment for a stigmatized condition like syphilis, they were unlikely to insist. Adding to the difficulty, Hughes's increasing reclusiveness made proper medical assessment nearly impossible. In his final years, he refused to see doctors in person, communicating only through intermediaries, and rejecting most medical interventions. The tragic irony is that if Hughes did have syphilis, it could have been easily cured with antibiotics had it been caught in time, reflected the medical historian. Instead, one of history's great fortunes couldn't purchase what a simple course of penicillin might have provided, a mind free from the ravages of a treatable disease. While Hughes's diagnosis remains speculative due to the secrecy surrounding his medical records, our next legendary figure's condition was well documented but deliberately obscured by family and associates trying to protect his legacy, a matinee idol whose fall from grace represented one of early Hollywood's most tragic declines.
I would like to inform you I am now talking into this inverted cuspidor.
John Barrymore. The Great Profile's devastating final act. John Barrymore, The Great Profile, was American theater and cinema royalty, celebrated for his Shakespearean prowess, matinee idol, good looks, and unmatched charisma. As the most acclaimed member of America's first family of theater, Barrymore's talent seemed limitless, until a mysterious decline transformed the legendary actor into a tragic shadow of his former self. While alcoholism has traditionally been blamed for Barrymore's deterioration, medical historians and biographers increasingly believe that neurosyphilis played a central role in his rapid cognitive collapse and early death at age 60. Barrymore's decline followed a pattern that's difficult to explain through alcoholism alone, noted a film historian who has studied the actor's final years. While he certainly drank heavily throughout his adult life, the sudden acceleration of memory problems, erratic behavior, and physical deterioration in his final decade points to an underlying neurological condition. The most likely culprit, given his lifestyle and symptoms, was syphilis. Barrymore's notorious sexual appetite created abundant opportunity for infection. From his early days as a stage actor through his Hollywood years, Barrymore's conquests were legendary, including countless chorus girls, actresses, and socialites during an era when syphilis was both common and highly stigmatized. Barrymore lived in a perfect storm of risk factors, explained a medical historian specializing in early 20th century diseases. He came of age in the theater world of the 1890s and early 1900s, where infection rates were extraordinarily high. He was famously promiscuous with partners from all walks of life, and he lived in an era when treatment existed but was lengthy, unpleasant, and often avoided due to social stigma. The timing of Barrymore's decline aligns with the typical progression of untreated syphilis. While he had always been a heavy drinker, his cognitive function remained relatively intact through the 1920s and early 1930s, the period of his greatest film successes. By the late 1930s, however, he began experiencing memory lapses so severe he could no longer remember his lines. The rapidity of Barrymore's decline was shocking to everyone who knew him, said a biographer who interviewed several of the actor's contemporaries. He went from being able to perform Hamlet from memory to being unable to remember a single line of dialogue in just a few years. His handlers began hiring cue men whose sole job was to feed him his lines through hidden earpieces or off-camera prompts. As his condition worsened, Barrymore's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would alternate between periods of brilliant lucidity and disturbing confusion. His legendary wit gave way to inappropriate outbursts and disorientation. By 1941, just a year before his death, he was essentially unemployable in any substantive role. The final films don't show the real extent of his deterioration, noted a film archivist who has studied Barrymore's later work. Directors would film around his limitations, shooting his scenes in tiny fragments that could be pieced together in editing. Even then, you can see moments of confusion break through the professional facade. Barrymore's death on May 29, 1942, from cirrhosis and kidney failure, has allowed alcoholism to take primary blame for his decline. However, medical experts who have reviewed accounts of his final years believe the cognitive symptoms point clearly to neurosyphilis as at least a contributing factor. The combination of memory loss, personality changes, and physical deterioration that Barrymore experienced is classic neurosyphilis, explained the neuropsychiatrist. While alcohol certainly damaged his liver, it doesn't explain the profound cognitive collapse. The two conditions likely worked in tandem, alcoholism masking and possibly accelerating the neurological damage from untreated syphilis. If Barrymore did indeed suffer from syphilis, why was it never acknowledged? The answer lies in the immense stigma surrounding the disease and the Barrymore family's concern for their dynasty's reputation. The Barrymores were America's theatrical royal family, the film historian noted. Acknowledging that their most brilliant star had died from a sexually transmitted disease would have been unthinkable in the 1940s. It was far more acceptable to attribute his decline to alcohol, a vice that carried far less social stigma, especially for male stars of that era. While the true extent of syphilis's role in Barrymore's decline may never be known with absolute certainty, his tragic final years serve as a powerful reminder of how effectively this disease could hide behind other diagnoses, destroying brilliant minds while preserving its secrets. Paul Mooney, the Oscar winner's mysterious decline. Paul Mooney represented the pinnacle of serious acting in early Hollywood, an Oscar-winning performer renowned for his chameleon-like transformations in films like Scarface, The Story of Louis Pasteur, and The Life of Émile Zola. His meticulous approach to character and disdain for Hollywood glamour made him one of cinema's most respected dramatic artists. Yet at the height of his critical and commercial success, Mooney began a puzzling retreat from public life, marked by increasingly erratic behavior, physical complaints, and eventual complete withdrawal from acting. A decline that some film historians and biographers believe may have been caused by undiagnosed or untreated syphilis. Mooney's career trajectory shows an unexplained turning point in the 1940s, observed a film archivist who has studied the actor's work. He went from being one of Warner Brothers' star's most valuable stars, a man who could essentially choose his roles and dictate his terms, to someone who worked sporadically, rejected scripts without explanation, and eventually withdrew from film entirely by the early 1950s. What makes Mooney's case particularly intriguing are the conflicting accounts of his health during this period. Official biographies typically cite rheumatoid arthritis and heart problems as the reasons for his declining output and eventual retirement. However, contemporaries described behaviors consistent with neurological issues that were never publicly acknowledged. There were concerning reports from sets during Mooney's later films, revealed a film historian who interviewed several people who worked with the actor in the 1940s. He would sometimes forget lines, something unheard of earlier in his meticulously prepared performances. He could be irrationally angry one moment and confused the next. These weren't public knowledge, but they were discussed quietly among industry professionals. While no definitive evidence confirms a syphilis diagnosis for Mooney, the circumstantial case includes several compelling elements. The actor spent his formative years in Yiddish theater during an era when syphilis was rampant in theatrical communities. His symptoms, including joint pain, cognitive fluctuations, and cardiac issues, are consistent with various manifestations of tertiary syphilis. The challenge with historical figures like Mooney is that medical records were often sanitized or destroyed to protect reputations, explained the medical historian. What we're left with are patterns of symptoms and behavior that suggest certain conditions without providing definitive proof. In Mooney's case, the pattern is suggestive of neurosyphilis, though we may never know with certainty. What gives the syphilis theory particular credence is how it would explain the otherwise baffling premature end to such a distinguished career. Mooney was just 61 when he made his last film appearance, relatively young for an actor of his type who didn't rely on physical action or romantic leads. His complete withdrawal from public life in his final 2 decades remains incompletely explained in conventional accounts. If you accept the possibility of neurosyphilis, Mooney's later years make more sense, suggested the biographer. The disease's progressive nature, with periods of remission and relapse, would explain why he occasionally attempted returns to work before withdrawing again. It would account for the personality changes that friends noticed but rarely discussed publicly. The question of Mooney's health remains one of early Hollywood's more persistent mysteries, a case where the full truth may have been deliberately obscured to protect the legacy of a deeply respected artist during an era when certain diagnoses carried overwhelming stigma. Oscar Wilde, the wit who died in exile. Oscar Wilde, playwright, poet, novelist, and the most brilliant conversationalist of his age, embodied wit and sophistication for the late Victorian era. His plays like The Importance of Being Earnest and Lady Windermere's Fan elevated comedy to high art, while his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray explored themes of decadence and moral corruption with unprecedented psychological depth. Yet this literary giant spent his final years in poverty and exile, his health deteriorating rapidly until his premature death at age 46, a decline accelerated by the ravages of syphilis that may have been contracted years before his infamous imprisonment. Wilde's medical history represents one of literary history's more complex puzzles, explained a scholar who has studied the writer's final years. While his imprisonment for gross indecency in 1895 certainly damaged his health through hard labor and poor conditions, the rapid physical and cognitive decline he experienced after his release in 1897 suggests an underlying condition consistent with tertiary syphilis. The evidence for Wilde's syphilitic condition comes from multiple sources, including contemporary accounts of his symptoms, the observations of doctors who treated him in his final years, and the pattern of his deterioration. After his release from prison, Wilde exhibited a collection of neurological and physical symptoms that align closely with neurosyphilis. Wilde suffered from severe ear infections that eventually spread to his meninges, the membrane surrounding the brain and spinal cord, noted a medical historian who has reviewed accounts of Wilde's final illness. This pattern of infection, combined with his cognitive symptoms and physical deterioration, is highly consistent with the meningovascular form of neurosyphilis. If Wilde did indeed have syphilis, when might he have contracted it? Biographers point to his university years or early adulthood as the most likely period, well before his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas that led to his downfall. There's a common misconception that Wilde's homosexual relationships were responsible for his syphilis, but this reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of both Wilde's biography and the disease itself, explained the scholar. Wilde had relationships with women in his early years, including encounters with prostitutes during his university days, a common practice among Victorian men that carried significant risk of infection. What makes Wilde's case particularly poignant is how his legendary wit remained intact even as his body failed him. Friends who visited him in his final years in Paris reported that though physically diminished, his conversation remained brilliant until near the end. The mind that had created some of literature's most perfect epigrams fighting against the disease that was destroying his body. One of Wilde's final quips came from his deathbed at the Hôtel d'Alsace, recounted the biographer. Looking at the shabby wallpaper in his room, he reportedly remarked, "One of us has to go." That capacity for humor in the face of death exemplifies why Wilde remains such a compelling figure. His wit was literally his final defense against tragedy. Wilde died on November 30th, 1900, with his official cause of death listed as cerebral meningitis. Modern medical analysis strongly suggests this was the final manifestation of tertiary syphilis that had been progressively damaging his nervous system for years. The tragedy of Wilde's case is multifaceted, reflected the medical historian. A brilliant artist destroyed not just by the social prejudices of his time, but by a disease that could have been treated had he lived just a few decades later. There's a painful irony that the author of Dorian Gray, a novel about hidden corruption gradually destroying its subject, may himself have been harboring a disease that was silently destroying him from within. Wilde's premature death robbed literature of countless works that might have been, had medical science advanced just a little faster, the plays unwritten, the novels never penned, the conversation never recorded, all casualties of a disease that claimed one of history's great minds while hiding behind other diagnoses. Edgar Allan Poe, the master of horror's real-life nightmare. Edgar Allan Poe created literature's most chilling explorations of madness, decay, and psychological torment, stories and poems that have defined the horror genre for nearly 2 centuries. The circumstances of his own death proved as mysterious and disturbing as any tale he penned, with his final days marked by delirium and confusion that culminated in his death at just 40 years old. While Poe's death has been attributed to numerous causes, from alcoholism to rabies to carbon monoxide poisoning, a growing body of evidence suggests that neurosyphilis may have been the actual culprit, providing a medical explanation for both his deteriorating mental state and his final, fatal delirium. Poe's death has become one of American literature's great mysteries, noted a literary historian specializing in 19th century writers. He was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore in October 1849, wearing clothes that weren't his own, unable to explain how he got there or what had happened to him. After 4 days of hallucinations, confusion, and calling out for someone named Reynolds, who was never identified, he died without providing any coherent explanation. The medical evidence for syphilis in Poe's case, while circumstantial, is compelling. His documented symptoms in his final days, including delirium, confusion, and rapid pulse, align with the neurological crisis that can occur in late-stage syphilis. Moreover, Poe had exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, memory problems, and emotional instability in the years preceding his death. If you examine Poe's life through a clinical lens, there's a progressive pattern of cognitive and behavioral changes that's highly consistent with neurosyphilis, explained a neurologist who has studied historical cases of the disease. His increasing inability to tolerate alcohol, episodes of disorientation, and volatile emotional states point to ongoing neurological damage rather than simply acute alcoholism. When might Poe have contracted the disease? Medical historians point to his time at the University of Virginia or during his brief military service as the most likely periods of infection. Poe lived in an era when approximately 10% of the population in urban areas had syphilis, the medical historian noted. As a young man moving through university environments and military postings, he was in high-risk settings during his most vulnerable years. The disease could have remained largely dormant for years before progressing to the neurological stage that likely contributed to his death. What gives the syphilis theory particular credibility is how it explains otherwise puzzling aspects of Poe's final years, including his strange tolerance for alcohol. Contrary to his reputation as a habitual drunkard, contemporary accounts suggest that Poe actually had an unusually low tolerance for alcohol. A single glass of wine could reportedly render him noticeably intoxicated. This hypersensitivity to alcohol is actually a recognized feature of neurosyphilis, the neurologist explained. The disease damages the blood vessels in the brain, making the patient extraordinarily sensitive to the effects of alcohol. What might look like alcoholism to outside observers is often a person with neurosyphilis having a severe reaction to a relatively small amount of alcohol. Poe's death certificate listed phrenitis, brain inflammation, as the cause, a diagnosis that would be consistent with the meningoencephalitic form of neurosyphilis. However, the stigma associated with syphilis made it common practice to list only the immediate cause of death rather than the underlying condition. 19th century death certificates were often exercises in discretion rather than diagnostic accuracy, observed the medical historian. Listing brain inflammation rather than syphilis would have been the standard practice to protect the reputation of the deceased, particularly for a public figure like Poe. The irony that America's master of Gothic horror may have died from a disease that mimics many of the psychological states he described in his work has not been lost on Poe scholars. His stories frequently feature narrators experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive distortions, states that closely resemble the neurological symptoms of tertiary syphilis. There's a haunting possibility that Poe's most disturbing stories, works like The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher, may have been informed by his own experience of neurological symptoms, suggested the literary historian. His extraordinary ability to describe altered mental states could have come from first-hand experience with the early manifestations of the disease that would eventually claim his life. While we may never know with absolute certainty whether syphilis caused Poe's death, the medical evidence offers a compelling explanation for one of literary history's most enduring mysteries, and a sobering reminder of how many brilliant creative minds may have been silently battling neurological deterioration even as they produced their greatest works. The disease that rewrote history. These six remarkable figures, Al Capone, Howard Hughes, John Barrymore, Paul Muni, Oscar Wilde, and Edgar Allan Poe, represent just the visible surface of a much deeper historical pattern. Extraordinary individuals whose lives and legacies were forever altered by a disease that medicine now controls with simple antibiotics. When we examine history through the lens of syphilis, we're forced to reconsider countless narratives about genius, madness, and decline, reflected a medical historian who has studied the disease's impact on prominent figures. How many eccentric geniuses were actually suffering from neurological damage? How many alcoholic declines were actually undiagnosed syphilis using alcohol as a mask? The implications are enormous. What makes these cases particularly poignant is the timing. All six figures lived during periods when syphilis was either untreatable or when treatments existed, but carried such stigma that many refused them. Had they been born just a few decades later, after the widespread availability of penicillin, their stories might have ended very differently. The discovery of penicillin's effectiveness against syphilis in the 1940s represents one of the most significant medical breakthroughs in human history, noted the neurologist. It transformed a devastating, potentially fatal condition into something curable with a few injections. The historical dividing line is stark. Before penicillin, syphilis destroyed lives. After penicillin, it became a manageable infection. This medical revolution came too late for our 6 subjects, each of whom suffered and died from complications of a disease that modern medicine has rendered largely controllable. Their stories serve as powerful reminders of both medical progress and the devastating human cost of stigma and silence surrounding disease. The secrecy and shame surrounding syphilis may have been as deadly as the disease itself, observed a public health historian. Because it was considered a moral disease associated with sexual behavior, many people avoided diagnosis and treatment even when it was available. The cultural stigma literally killed people who might otherwise have been saved. This stigma extended beyond the patients themselves to affect how their stories were told after death. Families, biographers, and institutions often conspired to obscure syphilis diagnoses, creating sanitized narratives that attributed decline to more socially acceptable conditions like alcoholism, overwork, or generic nervous exhaustion. There was an unspoken agreement among early biographers that certain diagnoses were unsuitable for public discussion, explained a literary scholar who has studied how medical conditions are represented in historical accounts. This wasn't just about protecting reputations. It reflected a genuine belief that great achievements should not be tainted by discussion of stigmatized illnesses. The result was medical misinformation that persists in many biographies to this day. As modern medicine and changing social attitudes have reduced both the prevalence and stigma of syphilis, historians and medical researchers have begun the complex task of reassessing historical figures whose decline may have been misattributed. This work isn't simply about correcting the historical record, it's about understanding the full human cost of a disease that shaped culture, art, and politics in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. When we recognize how many brilliant minds were cut short by this disease, we're confronted with one of history's great what-if questions, reflected the biographer. What might Wilde have written had he lived another 20 years? What technologies might Hughes have developed with an unclouded mind? What performances might Barrymore have given? The cultural loss is incalculable.